Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. In this episode, I'll be chatting with Trond Unheim, futurist, author, investor, serial entrepreneur, and a research scholar in global systemic risk, innovation, and policy at Stanford University. He's also the host of the Futurized podcast. Today, we'll be talking through some of the opportunities and concerns that many of us are seeing with the advances in technology and the possible futures that Trond is seeing as we progress into this new world. Welcome, Trond.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad you are here. You have a lot of background I'd love to get into here, but you have, with your background, I'd love to unpack some of the things you've got, because you've got a whole lot of things that have led you to where you are right now, related to some of the books you've written and also the research that you've been doing related to this whole Stanford existential risk initiative, which sounds actually a bit intimidating. So I'm hoping you can explain a little bit more about how you got here, what you're researching, and how you gravitated into this kind of work.
Sure. I'm a jack of all trades, always been interested in a lot of different things. So this whole new focus on risk is a convolution of different interests over time. And I realized, also because the world is full of risk, but I realized that a lot of what I had been doing, which relates more really to innovation than to risk, that there was a very deep connection. Because initially in my academic work, I really started out working on kind of social implications of web-based workplace technologies, which is partly what we're going to talk about today. But in the earlier generation of kind of just email and phone-based sort of technologies. And so the whole productivity aspect has been very interesting to me. But then I realized as I was working through all of these other technologies, either working for governments or large organizations, basically developing technology, or even just thinking about them, that as all of these emerging technologies come together, there is a confluence of risks that aren't always covered. So when people speak about existential risk, it's easy and far too easy to try to then become an expert again in one of those. And I realized maybe the point here, at least for me, is to enable an overview of a lot of these technologies and how they increasingly have to work together, do work together, or as they start working together, we haven't quite realized what happens when they do, and especially the risks that are produced. And one of the reasons is very few people endeavor to be an expert in all these things. And I don't pretend to be, but I think looking across all of these different areas has quite a lot of value. Incidentally, there's also value for innovation, because if you want to succeed long-term with innovation, you have to look at the risk aspect, because that also relates to your users and fitting into the society that you might succeed at creating a platform technology, but you need to make sure you know what that's going to do to the world. So
and sometimes
I'm sticking to that message.
You know that stuff, and sometimes you just don't, because the things change so strangely as you introduce those kind of things.
Yeah, emergence is a funny thing, right? You can say something about the general dynamics, but then the system itself just happens. And partly preparing for the future is preparing to adapt. So
yeah, that makes sense. As we start talking about the future, ChatGPT and other of these large language models have made a huge splash in the news recently. This is getting the attention of the organization's execs and their board members. So if you were consulting with a large organization like a bank or an insurance company or some other company that's been in some long established industry, how might you advise them to approach this new technology?
The first is you have to approach it. There's new research coming out. All consulting firms are now doing surveys on what do executives and workers do currently with generative AI technologies. And the truth is, pretty much everyone's experimenting with it, and no one really knows what they are, what the potential is going forward, obviously also, and what the legal implications are. So I think the number one is experimentation. Number two is you need to set setting clear guidelines so that you don't stress out your workers and managers unnecessarily, because these things they're happening now. There is really no going back. But on the other hand, governments and others really have been sleeping, right? So they are now slowly waking up to the overarching governance aspects, the management of these technologies, even in the short term, because they have some implications for the way that companies operate, the way skills are changing. So I think, yeah, there are numerous implications long term, but there's a set of very immediate opportunities and risks that need to be handled. And certainly skills development is very important. And there, I think, realistically, executives are not really going to be on top of the changes, but they have to have the broad organization on board. They have to ensure that at least their top people are enormously on top of what the changes could be and how they could implement new opportunities. But then they also have to just think about every single employee, because these technologies already, right, in the last few months have had very surprising effects on more advanced knowledge work functions. So we were all prepared for like low skill tasks to be automated. What we weren't so prepared for is these perplexing ideas that even very advanced knowledge work can now also not just be automated, but more realistically augmented in interesting ways that I certainly thought were perhaps a decade away. So that is something you cannot ignore.
So do you think, based on, you just mentioned it, the rapid acceleration of the technologies where we're becoming closer and closer to science fiction than we thought perhaps would be in our lifetimes, right? With the advances that we're making, that we're seeing just now, and the advances that we're seeing based on top of. So as you get this hierarchy of foundational activities related to large language models, and you build on top of them other technologies that help advance that, we're seeing this, again, rapid acceleration. How can an established organization, again, banking hasn't changed dramatically in the past 100 years. Certainly there's been technology added to it and with transfers and whatnot. Insurance certainly hasn't changed much in the past 100 years, other than perhaps adding new products to do, for airplanes and whatnot that didn't exist 100 years ago. But the reality is that these industries are very slow to change. How can this rapidly evolving technology be introduced, I won't say safely, but in a way that can be grasped and understood by an industry that is moving not as quickly as some others?
You're right. That particular industry, or that set of industries, hasn't moved particularly rapidly. And there's nothing inherently in generative AI that would immediately throw away 100 years. It's not like they are now going to start morphing overnight, and by Christmas we won't recognize the insurance industry. I don't think it's not that kind of technology. And partly it's because the workers and the institutions, they would have to opt to change also, right? So change isn't just technology washing over an industry. These are actually conscious choices. The industry could say, we are going to embrace these specific parts of the technology. What makes a lot more sense, though, is to say, what are the aspects we have been really frustrated with in our industry that stops us from collaborating, developing new products? And then you try to use these emerging opportunities specifically to attack these problems and not everything. Because even if there have been these very surprising use cases, especially in terms of generating summaries of texts and generating some sort of novelty, although it's not new, it's just if you have great training data, this generation generative AI is very good at reproducing that and summarizing it and making it somewhat useful. But so there's a lot of opportunity there. But again, I don't think the industry is well served by changing everything at once. It wouldn't be very useful. So I think picking a few things, and partly it's within each organization to say, what are we frustrated about? What do we think this technology can do for us this year? And it can't be everything. And then partly is cross-industry. What are things we, as perhaps the association of specific domains within finance and insurance, what do we agree have been our problems over the last 3, 5, 10 years. Some of these legacy systems, those things cannot be changed just because of one technology. You also have to say, we are all going to adopt 2 or 3 new things, and we're going to do it in controlled fashion over 3 years. So no amount of revolutionary technology is going to throw all that out, right? It's also embedded in legislation. It's not that easy.
So related to that, you mentioned legislation, and I was going to get back to some of that. Obviously, the industries you just mentioned, they're regulated. There's specific regulations associated with how they transact business. So it's not like we're going to reinvent a lot of things because they are somewhat controlled in how they do the business. Do you see a transition from a legislative or a regulatory perspective that would be influenced by these advances in a way that would be outside of their comfort zone? Could we actually push regulations in a positive direction to offer the ability for these industries to change more rapidly?
Yeah, what comes to mind for me is this sort of real-time compliance prospect. And so that even existing legislation, you can see much more directly, potentially. You could say, we are going to have you comply with these things, but we're going to make it enormously easier. In fact, you have to plug into these systems in an interoperable way, regardless which system you have, as long as you can communicate with a broad set of standards that we have for these systems in e-government fashion. And that could certainly be adopted as a principle for any future regulation, or indeed any future technology someone wants to put on the market and sell. So it's not just about the transparency more principle. I think, governments would be much more popular if the regulations they impose could be complied with in a very easy manner, perhaps semi-automatically, where the compliance itself doesn't make you so enormously frustrated that you start to act counter to the objective of the regulation just because you're so mad that part of your workday goes to just compliance.
Right.
That's not right. That's not innovative for sure. And it doesn't probably solve any safety or security issues either long term. So that's a joint responsibility across the industry with regulators, and certainly the executives in the finance industries have to, I think, keep that in mind.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as we look at you have regulations, and then you have the organizations that are being regulated, and then you have the people who are managing the compliance to those regulations. We start talking about people in general, corporate entities, big governments, it's all made up of people doing something, right? There's constructs that they work within that are called a government or called a corporation. And within those environments, we're seeing a definite change. Certainly from a demographic perspective, we're seeing most of the westernized world getting much older, and we're not really replacing the people that are aging out of the workforce as quickly as we'd like to. When you look at that feature of our just overall global environment, and at the same time, there was just recently an article how China is planning on producing all these humanoid robots in mass numbers. Are we seeing the rise of iRobot, the movie, kind of scenario happening where we're going to be seeing this interaction of physical robots and people in different ways than we perhaps expected in our lifetime?
So I'm going to be careful here, because up until literally 6 months ago, or perhaps up until a year ago, the conventional wisdom, which I guess was represented by some Oxford researchers who looked at the workplace and were voicing this whole idea of the robots going to take over low-skill work, and they had some arguments there. They were largely dispelled, however, by the MIT work of the Future study, which found very few robots in manufacturing in the US today, much fewer than they had expected. It also made some very important arguments surrounding the much more productive augmentation perspective, where you're augmenting human tasks than simply replacing them. So there's a place for both robots and augmentation type technology, whether it's devices or simply software or interfaces that make human workers just more productive. They're not going away, but they're becoming more productive, perhaps a little bit less in number, although then what happens is that the work tasks themselves are changing. However, then you got these chat-based interfaces that, of course, are generative all across text and voice and video and who knows what other type of content, and are acting on code and acting on in real life. And that's just the first generation. So things have changed quite dramatically. And it is nearly impossible right now to foresee what this technology is going to do. But that's not just because the technology is a runaway situation. It's more, I'm waiting for the other type of killer applications. They would have to materialize, however. So this takes creativity on behalf of those developing technology. It actually also takes a certain amount of openness in the US manufacturing industry. If you're talking about industrial robots, they would have to opt to put these robots in there and make those significant investments, right? It's not like this technology has taken away the need to invest. I guess it's a twofold situation. Yes, things are now in the future of, we are in the future of work faster than we perhaps thought. Things will change more dramatically than most analysts had thought, but everything will not change. And it is in this, which parts are going to be harder to change, where we have to make the argument and start to really think about what we want to change, and also realize that certain things, they haven't been changed because we didn't want them to change. They're unlikely to change because that may not be in society's overall interest to have large swaths of people on unemployment. I think this whole vision of not working is, I don't know, have you tried to be a year without doing anything productive? It's actually not very healthy. So there's a reason why we would want to stop that from happening. And I think we still have those powers, generative AI notwithstanding. I also think humans are very creative. We'll simply find new tasks. Question you had was really, will we see a lot of robots? I think robotic-like functions, whether they're humanoid or just industrial in nature, automatic functions there will be plethora of them. They're becoming cheaper. Generative AI makes them more interesting and complex. But I think in the foreseeable future, I am not so worried about human beings finding themselves in the workplace. And the surprising thing is that this is not going to be just a challenge that traditional blue-collar workers are going to face, right? There are so many blue-collar industry jobs where we're still going to need observations of technologies, monitoring technology. And then conversely, perhaps more surprisingly, the whole white-collar knowledge worker category. All of us in this category, academics, everybody, we are suddenly facing needing to upgrade our own skills. I can't sit there and write my articles ignoring this phenomenon anymore. So I think, and the fact that we are all challenged makes it a different ballgame. If it's just one group that's challenged, okay, that maybe we can't solve it. Maybe we're not willing to solve it. Now we all have the new chip on our shoulder. So I think the problem will be solved. We will evolve new skills, new job positions, new industries to deal with this and to be productive in this new environment. Well, so actually, all of this for me is generally positive, but I do think the finance and insurance industries have a lot of choices to make here.
So we've seen this before. We went from primarily an agriculture-based society to an industrial society, transitioning from the fields to the cities to working in factories and or in white-collar jobs. That transition has happened over the past 100 years more. But the reality is that there's still going to be components of those that are still required for all of us to function and survive. We still need food. So there's still need to be some kind of agricultural environment, but we don't all work in that industry anymore. So as we look at as these transitions from technology progress, perhaps, and I don't know the numbers, but perhaps insurance is going to reduce from whatever percent it is right now of the workforce to a much smaller number. We still need insurance. We may not have the number of people working in the insurance industry. And those who do work in the insurance industry may have more strategic roles in understanding how they build out insurance, how they create the products that are required for that particular time and the activities there. So when we start building that next level of job, you mentioned something about, have you ever been out of work for a long period of time and what does that do to your psyche? I know over the period of my career, I've worked in IT for quite a while, and I've had plenty of opportunities where organizations have ceased to exist. And I found myself with a lot of time on my hands. And that lack of purpose does eat away at who we are, because while we may choose to think that retirement and golfing all the time is going to be like the end all be all, the reality is there's some kind of purpose that we want to be able to get up in the morning and have that purpose to do something. And that in itself gives us some kind of benefit or gratification for who we are. And we can build our lives off of that one way or the other. As we see more automation or more transitions of our workforce, do you see that purpose piece will become much more enmeshed with our roles because it has to? Or is it something that's going to be something that we're going to desire to change our own roles to be something else?
Change is, for better or worse, not something individuals at least feel like we control, right? So we often feel like the systems are changing around us, the organizations, right? Our bosses come with new demands and we feel like we have to adjust. So I don't think that feeling necessarily will change, but of course your attitude to it can change. You can take the attitude that this is only natural, right? After all, there's no individual really causing all of this. So I think we can take a more productive attitude to the changes that seem to be happening. The other thing is we are the change. Generative AI doesn't just happen. These were developers who saw opportunities and innovated and made things happen that, of course, were somewhat of a surprise to people on the outside of that innovation. But I just want to pick up on something you said earlier, which is maybe there will be less people in insurance. I think job functions in industrial sectors have changed historically. You're right. From Industrial Revolution, a lot of changes happen. The basic human functions that some industries, though, are occupying, the niches that they are occupying may evolve. But I think you're right. And one future I could see is that almost every company becomes the financial institution. That would actually be pretty logical, because if you look at it and this is where I think the risk and innovation lens is pretty instructive. Right now, what we have is a specialized sector, or two, right? One that's executing financial functions, which have been outsourced to a whole domain of people doing that. There are trends indicating that pretty much every company should really understand finance because it's so basic, right? And understand that, especially as business models need to change much faster. It doesn't make a lot of sense to outsource something that is so core to your survival as a company. And then insurance and risk, right? We have had for a few hundred years this idea that we can outsource risk and pay for it in a separate institution. But what if all companies need to become responsible and more responsible citizens of the world, which I happen to believe? And together with that, you have the idea that maybe governance and governments, whether it's nation states or small or large or even smaller entities, haven't necessarily been the perfect stewards of the world. If you just think of climate change and many other things, it seems clear to a lot of us that as we're going through these transitions, governance is not something that we can put on some external entity that we call government and say, you guys have dealt with it, you guys are responsible for this. I think increasingly every organization is going to have to be accountable to the people they employ and the wider world in a much more direct way than before. So I don't think the function of insurance and the function of the very long-term perspective that an insurance company typically has, think about reinsurance. That's a business that either will go ballistic or will actually not have a function anymore because ultimately government has been regarded as the ultimate reinsurer. In an uninsurable world, not even government can it can save us, right? And maybe as these business models around reinsurance become more difficult, maybe all of business, they have to be their own reinsurers. So that has a number of consequences. I don't know, it doesn't necessarily have to go that way, but I think you're right. I just want to build on that point, Michael. I think the function of insurance and what that reflects, the understanding that risk is part and parcel of economic activity. And number two, that economic understanding and financial function is not something that is just a side aspect of running a business. It is the business. From that perspective, if you understand insurance and finance deeply, I would say you have a bright future. It just may not be in a specialized function selling back to the rest of companies around the world.
Makes a lot of sense, actually, to internalize those functions within the organization itself with some perhaps government constraints or constructs that you function within to support that without an industry doing that on your behalf. It's an interesting concept.
Especially if that's coupled with real-time governance, so that the governance itself is something you agree, and once you agree, it's pretty transparent whether you're complying or not.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually is an industry-driven compliance regime. It's just that it's guaranteed by third parties, whether they're governments or third parties controlled by governments and industry together. But the compliance has to happen in a much better way than before, but perhaps not delivered by a specific industry sector.
And all of these confluence of technologies tend to lead us towards that capability where real time is now real time. We can actually have up to the moment updates on everything we need to because the technology does support that. And it does it in a way that provides us with this immutable record that we can manage through the blockchain or some other way to maintain that record over time to ensure compliance, but also to have a record of it or a period of time then as well.
Yeah, except there's a rub though, which is that all of these things need to be maintained by someone and paid for by someone, right? Whether governments supply that resource or we all as citizens or indeed as companies pay into some sort of commons where that resource is taken care of. These things don't come for free. And I think we've seen that with generative AI. At least so far, they have been expensive to develop, expensive to maintain, take a lot of data. That data has to have some amount of integrity and it has to be real time. And if that data is polluted in some way, which it tends to be, then the cleanup job is serious business. And we are already in the realm of a world where we perhaps, what's real is becoming harder to grasp. And that's a real issue in insurance and a very real issue in financial functions.
And with elections coming up, the same type of thing, what's real and what's not becomes even more of a question as well. So this whole society is built upon information. And when you have the capability of manufacturing information in a way that seems plausible, it becomes then, how do you verify and validate this stuff to make your decisions upon?
Right. So that's why I come back to the function of governance is enormously important, and it's probably too important to leave to government.
Interesting.
Which sounds counterintuitive.
So if government is not the purveyors of that, who would be? It would be an industry group. How would you see that working?
For now, I think it's a checks and balances situation, and that's maybe not ideal, but I think just for now, for the foreseeable future, I don't see any trusted entities, right?
Okay.
Because nation states are just beholden to trying to make sure they continue to exist, which isn't necessarily a given or indeed perhaps not a great idea either. The alternative, however, when people are fighting for power, is that you start to protect your interests and start to preference your own interest over others. So they are not perfect stewards in the world we're going into. But the alternative, giving up government overnight, doesn't seem to exist. And I haven't seen that many trustable sort of industry consortia either, perhaps aside from the standardization bodies. I also don't think they are equipped to run the world. Plus it goes too slowly.
Right.
So look, we have a number of challenges we need to solve over the next 25 to 50 years. And I guess I thought we had at least 15, 20 years to try to build that new system. It would appear that we have more like 5.
Yes, things are moving quickly. So with that in mind, we're looking at, we see our current generation, and I don't want to put labels on any specific generations, but parents and children. How should parents be preparing their children for this future that you're seeing evolve based on some of the research and the things that you've seen?
I can tell you what I do with my children. I try to prepare them for change, but not to scare them. And I try to motivate them to figure out what their role is, very well knowing that a lot of the stuff that I try to teach will be out of date by the time they even get into the workforce. So I guess what I'm trying to tell my children is I'm trying to teach them through demonstrating a certain set of values. So I think values, they will also change, but they're at least something that you as a parent can try to emulate. So values are important, and that includes work ethic and choices in terms of what you spend time on, what kinds of spheres that you consider important. But then when it comes to skills, I think that none of our children will be able to afford to choose a path. Even my father told me that by the time I got into the workplace, I would probably be changing jobs every 2 to 3 years, perhaps even entire domains. Now, I have done that, perhaps not because the whole society had already changed like that. It just turns out to be me, my process. But I do think our kids, so let's just put it 10, 15 years into the future, the workplace is going to be totally transformed. If you are an expert in one thing, you're going to be working for a robot. If you're an expert in 2 to 3 to 4 domains and can communicate cleverly across those and are an enormously good communicator, a steward of automation, but also, I think most importantly, you understand the interface, the proper interface between you and a whole plethora of automatic systems that all have AI embedded in them, a mix of software and hardware. That's really where the skill is at. If you, in addition, can be an engineer of those systems, can be part of shaping those systems, at least shaping the user interfaces of those systems, then you're one of the shepherds of the new world. If you are not, unfortunately, if you dive into mathematics or you dive into languages, or you pick one, you're losing, meaning you're just going to be a servant. And I think that is something we all aspire not to be. We want to be shapers. So I try to tell my kids to explore a minimum of 2 to 3 technologies in some depth. I try to encourage them to have some physical skills because I think those will still be important. And then if everything goes wrong, the risk perspective is you used to be taught you got to understand how to feed yourself and all that stuff. Yes, I do teach them that. My biggest advice to people for surviving the end of the world is basically you need about 200 friends, right? With very different skill sets placed strategically all around. And you need duplicates of those friends, and they need to be trustable relations because
so these aren't just Instagram followers?
No, these are the people that you are going to have to tap into when it all goes south. And it could be that we all are going to need them because in some way it is all going to go south, meaning we are going to need to trust each other in much more advanced trust relationships than in any previous civilization, right? It's going to take so much to try to make it through the next century. And those skills are not taught in schools today.
That makes it more difficult then to learn them, isn't it?
It's also difficult because there are no teachers of these things. I'm just a futurist who has some sort of very slim little perspective towards something that I intuit is happening, but none of us have a blueprint for this future. And for the first time in many hundred years, I think this is not just going to be something where we talk about things changing. A lot of things are going to change. But to take it back to your original topic, finance, insurance, I'm not entirely sure that 50, 100 years from now, we will recognize some of those functions. And some of those things probably will have changed from far less than I am maybe making it out to be now. It's just that in order for us to prepare for the very massive changes that will happen, we might need to prepare for a more exaggerated change than it's actually going to happen. Because I'm not one to say you will not recognize the world if you plop down on the planet 50 years from now. But we cannot be sure which aspects will remain the same. And we certainly can't be sure that those are the ones that we succeed at currently.
So in the meantime, hug your kids, make sure that they can teach them what it means to be human and to interact with humans in a way that is meaningful. And
yeah, start with interacting with humans and then become really adept at interacting with whatever emerging technology is moving about.
it makes sense. It makes sense. This was a very inspiring conversation and very interesting because it's not often that we hear these kind of perspectives. And certainly you doing this day to day gives you a different perspective than others have because we don't have the luxury of being able to do that. You've been put in this position and you have the capabilities and the insights to be able to bring this into layman's terms, where perhaps we can be learning a little bit more than we have right now in a way that helps us to evolve into that future state that we need to be in.
I hope I've also conveyed that I am a cautious optimist on the future, provided that we do certain things. I think that the potential of generative AI, of synthetic biology, of quantum, of nanotech, of a host of other technologies that don't really have names yet, they are numerous. And as long as we maintain the perspective that we are the shepherds and the guardians of those technologies, and we need to explore them, disregard what we don't like, and encourage other directions and manage them properly, we can make changes and we can have some wonderful few hundred more years, perhaps 1,000 more years. And God forbid, it's very hard to see any further than a few hundred years, but maybe we can even survive as humanity. Wouldn't that be great?
I would vote for that one, yes. All right, before we go, are you working on any new books?
Yes. So I am working on a book that's going to try to put all of this into, like you said, layman's terms. Right now, I'm struggling more with a certain demographic that I find it hard to communicate to, because I'm going to write about what's, I think, is the best way to approach what might happen and what's the best way to approach the next 25 to 30 years of society. And the biggest challenge I'm having right now with that, baking in emerging technologies, geopolitics changes that will happen to organizational and individual players on this new stage. How do I motivate people who say 30 years from now, I won't care very much because I'll be either retired or dead or dying? So what I'm trying to do now is to enter that mindset of such a person, who I hope is not me. I hope to be very much kicking 30 years from now. We shall see. But I want to speak to people who are 60, 70 today, and also be relevant to them. Because I think this is not an argument where, let's say the people between 50 and 80 years old who are today in all kinds of positions of power, if they don't take a deep interest in the future, we are all going to suffer for it. And I find that somehow the interest in the future today is concentrated, ironically, perhaps in the younger generations, that most people always say they don't think about others. We don't get a do-over here. So if you're in power and you're between 50 and 70, this is the only chance we get, perhaps, to shape the only humanity we have left. And we can make really good choices. And there are so many kind of mitigation strategies and exciting things, very exciting futures that I can see. But there are unfortunately a few paths of no return. And they're the ones that are the most likely right now, with something like 80% probability. So it is imperative to speak to that. We have to motivate the very, very dramatic changes. And I'm not just talking about climate. I'm talking about geopolitics. I'm talking about stewardship of AI, synthetic biology, and all the other technologies we just briefly talked about. This is not it's going to go much faster, but it's also going to be somewhat more surprising than many of us thought. And then, like I said, there'll be a remainder. There'll be a surprising result. That's probably going to be that many things are going to stay almost exactly the same, because as human beings, we're probably going to regress towards some sort of mean, whatever that is. We liked those things and we're going to keep them. But it's going to be a labor of love to get there. And so that's what the book is about. The new labor of love of
when
humanity.
do you expect that come out?
About this time next year.
I'm very much looking forward to that for sure. Trond, it was fantastic talking with you today. I really appreciate our conversation. I know our listeners will be inspired by the things you've mentioned, and I will put links to Trond's books in the show notes, because I know everyone's going to want to read these things. You have a very unique perspective on the future activities and the future as you see it. And I think it's very interesting. So I'm going to make sure people are exposed to that as well. So thank you again for joining us today.
It was a great pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you've heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how SS&C Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.